Alright, guys. We finished up in Leviticus yesterday. There was some stuff in the last chapter, chapter 27, about tithing and stuff like that, but it wasn't really anything that I hadn't already mentioned before. Um, but moved on to Numbers and got about 3 chapters in before I kind of began to see some. God kind of began to speak to me. Um, and he starts off in chapter 1, and he's outlining basically the 12 tribes, and he's telling them, hey, you need to go and take a census of all these people, and everybody from the age of 20 years up, or 20 years old and up, and you're going to number them basically to build an army. But then he gets over towards the end of chapter 1 and verse 47, he says, but the Levites after the tribe of their fathers were not numbered among them. For the Lord had spoken unto Moses, saying, only thou shalt not number the tribe of Levi, neither take the sum of them among the children of Israel. And he goes on to talk about how the reason for this was because the Levites were consecrated to God. They were separated for God's use. And I see a lot of similarities in this in the church, where, well, let me finish going on here. In chapter 3, of the Levites, within that Levite community, it was also further broken down by his sons, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari, or Merari. And then from there, he says the Gershonites are supposed to camp over here on the west side, and they're going to be responsible for the tabernacle, the tent, the coverings, and the hanging of the door. And then the Kohathites, he tells them that they're to camp over on the side of the tabernacle on the south side, and that their job is to be in charge of the ark and the table, the candlesticks, and the altar and the vessels in the sanctuary. And then the Merarites, he tells them that they're to camp over on the north side, and that they're responsible for the boards of the tabernacle, the bars thereof, the pillars, the sockets, and so on and so forth. So basically what you see is you see kind of a pattern starting to emerge where you have all of the Israelites, all of the people of God, and not everybody is in ministry. And I see this sometimes when I go to some churches where the pressure is really placed on people to get into the ministry somehow. But God specifically tells them, he goes on in this chapter to tell them that even if a stranger comes over and tries to help the Levites set up the tent, that stranger is supposed to be killed. And the point being is that God has consecrated certain people for ministry, and others he is consecrated to protect and support that ministry. So you have the 12 tribes whose job is basically was to raise up this army and to protect, themselves, to protect the Levites, to provide for the Levites, through their tithing and stuff like that. But that their job was not to be in ministry. One of the things that David said in the Psalm was that, one of his greatest desires was to dwell in the house of the Lord forever. David wanted to be in the ministry, but it wasn't what God had called him to. God had called him to something else. And even in the midst of David's sin with Bathsheba, he has a son, Solomon. And then Solomon ultimately builds this great temple, and then of that line you ultimately have Jesus. So it's really kind of interesting that even though David had a heart and longing to be with the Lord in ministry, it wasn't what he was called to do. He was called to be king, and that's what he ended up doing. And God used his position for good. And we see that even when we go to 1 Corinthians 12. We see in verses 4, now there are diversities of gifts, but the same Spirit, and there are differences of administrations, but the same Lord. And there are diversities of operations, but the same God which worketh in, or which worketh all in all. And the point being is that God has gifted people with certain abilities, and not everybody is going to be in ministry. He goes on in verse 28 and says, and God has set some in the church, okay, in the Levite type, category, has set some in the church, first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, after that miracles, after that healings, helps, governments, diversities of tongues. And then he goes on and he asks a rhetorical question: are all apostles? Are all prophets? Are all teachers? Do all work miracles? Do all have the gift of healing? Do all speak with tongues? And this is a rhetorical question, and he's asking this rhetorical question and saying, look, not everybody in the ministry is going to be the one doing the sacrifice, so to speak. Just like in the Old Testament, not all of the Levites had the same job, but they were in the ministry. But not all of the Israelites were in ministry. Some of them were appointed to help the ministry, to support the ministry. So I think that's something that we need to kind of come to grips with, is each one of us is called to glorify God, but not all of us are called to be in some sort of ministerial position. Some may be, and those who are, God gifts them with the abilities to do that and provides them the opportunity to be in that ministry, and then He works the effectiveness of that ministry. And that's what 1 Corinthians 12 verses 4 through 6 is talking about. But if that's not what we're called for, if we're not called for ministry, that doesn't mean that we don't do anything to serve God. It means that in all that we do, we glorify God. So if you teach at school, if you are a roofer, whatever your position is, you glorify God in that position. So anyway, something I wanted to share. All right, God bless.